básicamente de lo que hoy les voy a hablar es de lo que viene en materia de política económica para Argentina. Y de hecho, por suerte, en esta era moderna donde está el archivo instantáneo, aparecen los archivos. Y hará algo así como de 2 meses, una de las cosas que dije en uno de los discursos es: si los degenerados fiscales que están en el Congreso de la Nación Argentina quieren romperme el programa económico, lo voy a vetar.
What I'm going to talk to you about today is what's coming in terms of economic policy for Argentina. And, in fact, luckily, in this modern era of instant archiving, archives appear. And about 2 months ago, one of the things I said in one of the speeches was, if the degenerate prosecutors in the Argentine National Congress want to destroy my economic program, I will veto it. And indeed, yesterday, the degenerate prosecutors overwhelmingly voted for a nonsense that involves taking on 62% of GDP in debt, which is a measure that costs Argentines $370 billion, ruining the lives of our children, our grandchildren, and our future generations. Therefore, in the face of such an act of irresponsibility, populism, and demagoguery, I have no choice but to change my speech and come and tell you. But fortunately, the file is on my side. In that sense, I'm going to start with fiscal policy issues. I'm going to give my 4 arguments for why I've decided to completely veto the nonsense that came out yesterday. Then I'm going to talk about the zero deficit rule. I'm going to talk about zero emissions, and I'm going to talk about economic growth. The first thing to keep in mind is the quantitative issue, that is, the lie that the liars among the legislators, whether in the Chamber of Deputies or the Senate, relied on after the shameful Kirchner administration, when pensions in real terms fell 40% at their worst point and ended up 30% lower. Since we came to power, pensions in real terms, despite all the macroeconomic restructuring we're doing, are up 5%. That is, pensions beat inflation, but not only that. The counterpart to what they talk about is exchange rate appreciation, which means that dollars also grew significantly. Since we are systematically eliminating regulations and moving toward a freer economy, this means that in terms of dollars, not only are we better off, but those dollars actually have greater purchasing power. Therefore, retirees are much better off than the mess they left us, and I won't even tell you if the bomb had exploded. Therefore, the first question is a quantitative one regarding how retirees are truly doing today. Another thing that I also find interesting is the contradiction in politics. That's why I mentioned the archive. You can go see my talk at the IAEF, when the irresponsible people in the Chamber of Deputies had sent this, and I said, if this gets out, I'm going to veto it. The irresponsible members of the Senate, in a populist, demagogic, lying, and impoverishing manner, above all impoverishing and exterminating youth. In other words, because measures like yesterday's exterminate young people, I said I would veto it, and indeed I vetoed it. In other words, I do what I always say. My word is not negotiable. And I will not let the degenerate prosecutors who want to ruin this country get away with even a millimeter of their opinion. And so, while I can resist the shelving of the bill, the Kirchnerists cannot, for example, look at the statements made by Nestor Kirchner in 2010, by Mrs. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, or by Miguel Pacheco himself. They all voted against the 82% mobile tax. In fact, Mrs. Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner vetoed the 82% mobile tax. Therefore, the shelving cannot be upheld. What's more, the fact that pensions are in bad shape, being a pay-as-you-go system, that is, there's a pot from which money is taken and distributed, is the irresponsibility of having retired people without contributions. In other words, they put 3.5 million people in without having contributed. In other words, faced with the same pot, more hands are taking out. In other words, if you want to know who has ruined pensions, look at the Kirchnerists. Because when the system was stabilized, the private pension fund system, in order to grab the funds, yes, they expropriated it. Retirement should have been in the hands of the state, and what did they do? They emptied the system, they ruined it. Now, and on top of that, there are a million fake pensions. So do you want to see where the disaster is? It's there. Now, that disaster is so clear the disaster that Kirchnerism caused with that during President Macri's administration, they tried to correct it. There were 14 tons of stones to put the pension system in order. So the question is, the Kirchnerists saw this in the government, and Together for Change saw this. Can you tell me what the hell they all did voting to break the pension system and ruin the lives of Argentinians? If that isn't populism, if that isn't demagoguery, if that isn't being a lying fraud, I'd like to know what we're talking about. Not only that, but there's also the problem with the law, which is a matter of asymmetry. That is, when the situation is adverse and a reduction is made, it doesn't decrease, but when it increases more than proportionally. This also means that, dynamically, pension spending is growing and uncontrollable. In other words, it's directly bankrupting the state. Therefore, there are several issues related to design problems, hypocrisy in the data, demagoguery, populism, lies, irresponsibility, ignorance. But not only that, it's also interesting because it's a law that violates a law. Precisely what it does is violate the financial administration law. That is, when you decide to create a budget, you should also create a mechanism to fund that budget. Now, then, there's a violation of the state's financial administration law. Why? Because they blithely created a budget, an expense, and it has no corresponding resource. Now the problem is, okay, I don't have the resources, so that increase in spending is going to require an increase in resources. There's a brilliant quote from Keynes that says, all expenses are financed. All expenses are financed. The issue is how they finance them. In other words, they're going to finance them somehow. So, for example, politicians blithely like to use the money printing machine, that is, the issuance of currency. In short, they spend irresponsibly, print money, and generate inflation, which is nothing more than a tax, which also has the characteristic of being profoundly regressive. In other words, the champions of the do-gooders, those who love the poor so much, only multiply them. And in that sense, what did we say? No, no, no. Here the printing press has been turned off. No more printing, which I will explain in part 3 of the presentation. So, we have decided not to defraud Argentines anymore with seigniorage. I should warn you that seigniorage, that is, the issuance of money to finance the treasury, is even worse than what is called the inflationary tax, and that it is the true measure of the scam, not the inflationary tax, because if I issued money in line with the demand for money, inflation would be zero. So, what would they say? That there is no scam there. Wrong. Because it means that I do have an element that allows the demand for money to grow. If I didn't issue money, there would be deflation. Therefore, if I'm issuing money in that context, I'm robbing them of the positive effect of deflation. Why? Because real balances would be increasing, and now they would be constant. In other words, the real scam is seigniorage, the issuance of money. But well, imagine, I say, politicians can't add up even with an abacus. They talk about debt reduction and then complain about fiscal adjustment, in other words, which is complicated. I mean, they don't add up. They simply don't know how to add up. I mean, it's not so easy to conduct politics when there are people who, again, can't add up even with an abacus. The other alternative is, well, then we don't want more inflation, because we don't want to impose a tax that will do so much harm to those who have the least. Because at its core, it's a regressive tax, impacting the most vulnerable more than 25 or 30 times. That is to say, the direct blow to the supposedly retirees they want to protect is, for example, the groups they hit hardest. Let them come to an agreement. Because obviously if you want good social policy, the best social policy, do you know what it is? Lowering inflation. But well, it seems that lesson isn't taught. They like to charge taxes that no one notices. The other alternative is to take on debt. Now, when I start taking on debt, what's the problem? My solvency conditions deteriorate. The consequence of deteriorating solvency conditions is that they won't lend me at the same rate, they'll lend me at higher rates. In other words, something called country risk appears. Imagine if politicians have trouble calculating additions and subtractions. Imagine understanding what the interest rate and country risk are. So, in this context, this rise in the interest rate implies that capital accumulation is lower, meaning I have less investment. By having less capital per capita productivity is lower. And by having lower per capita productivity, the economy's real wages are lower. That is, even if I can avoid the inflationary tax and disguise it with debt, I'm still harming people through higher interest rates, lower productivity, and therefore lower real wages. In other words, There's no such thing as a free lunch. And the other alternative is to simply raise taxes, that is, expropriation. It violates property rights. That's why what we put in the Riggy is so interesting. If there's one thing that has characterized the Argentine state over the last 123 years, besides the fiscal deficit, consider that in 123 years, we had a deficit for 113 years. Not only that, but the 10 years we had no deficit, we were actually in default. Therefore, it's false that there was no deficit. Therefore, we are the first government since the beginning of the 20th century to date to have a serious fiscal surplus. Because not only are we achieving primary results, but we are also paying the interest. Look at the situation, and we're starting with a deficit of 5 percentage points of GDP. We're supposedly under management, and we fixed this in the first month. In other words, we've had the best fiscal performance in Argentine history, thank you. And since this is obviously working and we're lowering inflation, I'll get into the details later on the monetary side. Obviously, the filth of the political establishment wants to disrupt our fiscal balance. Do you know why? Because if it goes well, their job is over. So, it's important that we know how much this costs. In general, what you're going to see is that politicians are very deceitful and also have confirmation bias. And they hire and ask economists who are also deceitful to do the numbers. So I say, some liar will appear who wants to justify this aberration by saying that the cost of the measure is 0.4 percentage points of GDP. Well, first of all, that's a lie because the cost of what was passed yesterday is 1.2 percentage points. And if you take the average interest rate Argentina pays, which is 5%, that would imply, plain and simple, an increase in the debt-to-product ratio of 24 percentage points. That is, the equivalent of Argentina's foreign debt. In other words, Argentina has several types of debt. The portion that Guzman, for example, needed to restructure because it was impossible to pay was 24 points of GDP. That is, yesterday's measure implies 24 points of GDP if taken linearly. Now, the reality is that one of the things I mentioned is that there is a question of asymmetry. And every time you have economic growth, that asymmetry will capture it. Therefore, in that context, look, if Argentina wants to converge to becoming a developed country and a powerhouse in, say, 40 years, it has to grow at 4.5% per capita. This means that if we were growing at 2, it would be a pretty poor number. We'd be stuck at these relative levels. In other words, we wouldn't have to do anything. The dynamics of the world itself would take us there. If we didn't do anything stupid, which is a strong assumption. But beyond that, therefore, 2% per capita with a population growing at 1 equals 3. This means that if I then calculate the true fiscal cost of the measure, it's 62% of GDP. That is, yesterday's joke, that brutality, typical of idiots, cost us $370 billion. I repeat, 62% of GDP. $370 billion. Did you expect me not to veto such nonsense? Naturally, the consequence of this is that if I do this, I'm going to have to finance it, and if I'm going to finance it, I'm either going to have an inflationary tax, or I'm going to have sky-high country risk, or I'm going to increase the explicit tax burden to the point that I end up destroying the growth rate. The problem is that, by destroying the growth rate, I don't just have a productivity problem, I'm condemning our children, our grandchildren, and future generations to live in miserable conditions. Because if 2/3 of children today are below the poverty line, nonsense like yesterday's will plunge them all into poverty. In other words, these policies that Argentina has been implementing for more than 120 years only serve to impoverish us. Clearly, it's not nice to do what I did. But I also told you that I preferred to tell you an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. For comfortable lies, go and find the senators who voted yesterday. Those liars can tell you anything you want to hear. They'll also impoverish you and ruin the lives of your children, your grandchildren, and all generations to come. I came here to put my neck on the line to save Argentina, not to sink it. That said, we'll now move on to what is strictly fiscal policy. We have announced a zero deficit policy. A zero deficit isn't a whim. First, we saw that deficits always have to be financed. Therefore, I say, one way or another, they will be paid. And given that, we say zero deficit, but really, not zero primary surplus, because that's a lie, because interest makes us have it. I warn you that a zero primary surplus isn't enough if you have debt. It's only enough if you don't have debt. If you have debt and have to pay interest, it's not enough. In that context, what you have is a zero deficit implies that the financial deficit is zero. If the financial deficit is zero, the change in debt is zero. If the change in debt is zero, the debt-to-product ratio is non-increasing. If the debt-to-product ratio is non-increasing, you are solvent intertemporally. What does that mean? You can repay the debt, and therefore your credit profile improves. Not for nothing, since we took office, country risk was close to 3,000 basis points and had breached 1,200 at one point. But, well, then the fiscal degenerates started doing these things. And obviously we paid for it with a higher country risk, but we're going to continue resisting. I mean, I'm not going to hand over the fiscal result. I'm not going to hand it over, even if the fiscal degenerates keep insisting. And this is important because if I lower the country risk, lower the interest rate, I generate a situation of greater investment, greater productivity, and higher wages. In other words, it should be important for the political class that Argentina become investment grade. But well, here they like to spend more. That said, I'm going to explain how the zero deficit is implemented. Because how were budgets made in Argentina? Basically, what you have is a set of expenses, which becomes an obligation. You have an estimated revenue, so the revenue is uncertain. And from there they get the primary deficit, they calculate the interest and arrive at the financial figures. And from there they have to set up the financing. That was the old methodology. So what happens? If you make a mistake in the inflation estimate or the GDP estimate, you're left with underreported revenues and a huge fiscal deficit appears, and then you have to finance it. One of the things Kirchnerism did, and it did so brutally, was lie about inflation. Why did it do that? Because then it underestimated revenues. And everything that came from above was the famous whip and wallet. Then it made all the provinces have to go kiss the ring at the Casa Rosada. I don't want that. I want serious federalism. I want all of Argentina to be free and not depend on a despot who sets capricious numbers to bring the provinces to their knees. In this sense, the primary surplus will have to equal the interest on the debt. The interest on the debt is determined by the interest rate paid on that debt, which is a given, and by the debt we had accumulated. And then the primary surplus must equal that number. Now, that number must equal the difference between revenue and expenditure. From there, a revenue estimate is made, which makes it clear that this revenue estimate is important to be able to later allocate non-automatic public spending. Then you present a macroeconomic scenario. What happens is that, if you look at the forecasts of the econocentrists at the end of last year or the beginning of this one, they had inflation hypotheses of around 350–400% for next year. They were correcting them, and today the market consensus is 40%. It seems that we are doing some management work and some monetary work. So, I can't stick with a revenue hypothesis in the face of such a disinflationary process. So, I need to put together a budget that has items that accommodate that. In this sense, given that baseline scenario, I can determine spending so that it's consistent with interest payments and the rest of the spending. And there you'll have spending items that have automatic adjustments, for example, pensions, which are linked to the macroeconomic scenario and move accordingly, which makes sense. So, in public spending, there will be an induced component that has to do with the macroeconomic scenario, so you're eliminating that risk, and there's remaining discretionary spending. So, what's the point of determining the baseline scenario? So that, in the remaining spending, the remaining discretionary spending, you have the composition of that spending. The shares of each of the components of that discretionary spending. So, when the macroeconomy moves in a different direction than the baseline scenario, this allows us to determine how discretionary spending must also be adjusted. Therefore, this is the mechanism we will be presenting in the budget. This way, we can guarantee a zero deficit and ensure that a zero deficit is no longer a reality for Argentines. Now, there will clearly be deviations. So, one of the things that can happen is that the observed growth rate is higher than we had estimated. So, the question is this temporary or permanent? If it is temporary, what happens to you when you receive income? Under the permanent income hypothesis, your income increases temporarily. You don't increase consumption in line with the increase in permanent income, which is small, because what has increased is temporary. So, in the short term, a difference arises. And what do you do with that? They save, they raise cash, and that gives us resources to manage the financial policy for the debt that already exists. On the other hand, if the increase is permanent and means that income has moved up a notch, can you imagine what I'm going to do? I'm going to lower taxes, or do you think I'm going to let the politicians spend it? On the other hand, if the growth rate is lower, what this mechanism allows is to recalculate all spending downwards. Obviously, discretionary spending will suffer much more than induced spending, which is quite obvious. And the most interesting thing about all this is that the budget construction is neutral to inflation. Therefore, we can continue to aggressively advance in lowering inflation because it won't generate a budget mismatch. So, I've just presented what our fiscal policy will be from now on. On the other hand, what I'm going to do now is explain monetary policy, what we have defined as zero issuance. Basically, when we came to power, one of the things I never complain about, I describe the legacy. But I don't complain about the legacy. I'll put it this way, if I'm the first liberal libertarian president in the history of humanity, it's obvious I wasn't going to come to power under normal conditions of pressure and temperature. I mean, I wasn't going to become president if we lived in Switzerland. I mean, it was obviously going to be a disaster of massive, biblical proportions for this atypical situation to occur. The black swan. In that context, we came to power and daily inflation was close to 1.2%, which in annualized terms implied 7,500% inflation. This seemed like a scandal and an exaggeration when you consider wholesale inflation, which is what anticipates CPI inflation, consumer inflation. It was 54%. 54% annualized gives 17,000. Imagine that. In other words, our politicians can't compute addition and subtraction. Imagine a geometric function, that is, an exponential function. I don't even attempt an exponential function. I mean, because I think I've raised it to something, and I say, they're going to collapse. So, I say, I prefer to use the discrete version, which I imagine can at least multiply with a calculator at my side. That said, we knew we were on the verge of hyperinflation. And if there's one thing that has characterized me over the years, it's having hammered home Friedman's phrase that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's generated by an excess supply of money, either because supply increased or demand fell, or both happened simultaneously. This leads to a loss of the purchasing power of money, and all prices expressed in monetary units rise. So, if we were facing a hyperinflationary scenario, what we had to do was turn off the issuance taps. In fact, the first problem we faced was the size of the fiscal deficit. We were facing a fiscal deficit of 15 points of GDP, 5 in the Treasury and 10 in quasi-fiscal deficits at the central bank. The aggravating factor was that this was becoming endogenous monetary issuance, meaning there were mechanisms by which the money supply was already expanding on its own. Even though our great central bank president, Santiago Basile, had his eye on it. So, the first thing, but what's happening, was that this problem couldn't be solved until we could construct a peso curve. That's why I systematically praise the work of Pablo Cuerno, who was the one who recreated the peso curve. And the other thing was to attack the fiscal deficit. And that was done. I remember that when we were campaigning, we went around with a chainsaw and they basically said that what I was proposing was crazy. In fact, the vast majority of economists said that with luck, 1 point of GDP could be adjusted. And we arrived. The program with the fund was dead. The only thing the fund asked of us was to see if we could get close to the goals set by the previous government, which was quite lax. And we proposed that we would achieve a zero deficit in the first year. So we set a more demanding goal than the one the fund had set. Fortunately, one of our greatest successes was choosing Toto Caputo as Minister of Economy, and we achieved a zero deficit in our first month in office. In other words, something that couldn't be achieved in 123 years was achieved by that giant Luis Toto Caputo in a month. He certainly has merit in being the best Minister of Economy in history. In fact, they first said we were doing this by not paying. They made up a ton of things about us. They said it wasn't sustainable, that the surplus would fall in February. And it didn't fall in February. It didn't fall in March. We finished the first half of the year. We had a surplus until June, with the seasonality of public accounts. And in the first 7 months, given that maturities fall in July, we accumulated a ton of surpluses. We have 17 trillion pesos in the central bank account, and between now and the end of the year, we'll be cutting through surpluses between 6 and 9 trillion pesos more. Imagine if the chainsaw hasn't really worked. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I mean, we had the quasi-fiscal problem, which was twice the size of the one we had in the treasury. In fact, we arrived and had 4 monetary bases in overnight securities. In other words, we had the hyperinflation in place. You can imagine what it means to multiply the amount of money by 5 in one day. That said, what do we basically do? We open up the foreign exchange market. We sought to make the exchange rate, plus the country tax, similar to the parallel rate without any transparency. And this jump in the exchange rate meant that the arbitrage interest rate between pesos and dollars, while positive in dollars, was negative in real peso terms. I remember many economists saying, "No, we have to raise the interest rate, it has to be a positive real interest rate." If we had done that stupid thing, and you go and look at the December and January reports, and you'll find them all there, Today we would have between 8 and 10 monetary bases in interest-bearing liabilities. Inflation wouldn't have dropped. We would be discussing hyperinflation. We would be discussing expropriations. We would be discussing anything but, I mean, lowering inflation. Therefore, I dedicate Maradona's famous quote to those who want to conduct monetary policy by controlling the interest rate. Theoretical beatings are an understatement. That said, no one was talking about eliminating the interest-bearing liabilities of the LELIQs. No one was talking about it. I mean, the only one who was talking about it. Do you know how I felt? More alone than Adam on Mother's Day. Of course, they were all concerned with, what was it? Noodles. Sauce. I don't have noodles. I don't have sauce. It seems to me that all that did them harm. Aside from that, they never said how they were going to solve that problem. We did face it head on. The fact that we went to arbitrage the interest rate in dollars and that resulted in a negative real interest rate in pesos allowed us to, what? Basically, liquefy the interest-bearing liability position, without implying a speculative attack on the currency, while cleaning up the stock problem left to us by the previous government, which we haven't finished yet, but we're working on. So, in that context, it seemed impossible to end the interest-bearing liability problem, and they were going to fix it all by magic. No, not by magic. If I had told you I was going to keep it constant, you would have applauded me. Incredibly, in 7 months of my administration, we eliminated interest-bearing liabilities and ended the quasi-fiscal system. With that, in 7 months of my administration, we implemented a fiscal adjustment of more than 15 points of GDP, making it the largest fiscal adjustment in human history. Look at how poorly we've managed our economic policy. But obviously, it wasn't enough. In collusion between the International Monetary Fund and the previous administration didn't meet its goals. It didn't meet its monetary goals, it didn't meet anything. But nevertheless, they continued to run a fiscal deficit. To give you an idea, throughout the Kirchner administration, a deficit of 28 points of GDP was financed with monetary issuance. In the last year, it had been 13 points of GDP. Do you realize the magnitude, the delirium? The silver platform plan to try to win an election, the disaster they had left in the balance. And in that context, one of the things that the International Monetary Fund allowed the irresponsible members of the previous government to do was to use puts. What's the characteristic? Banks didn't want to finance the government. They preferred to go to the central bank because if there was a liquidity problem, they could execute and, with that, get hold of the pesos and preserve the liquidity problem, which is so important within a bank, liquidity management. So, in that context, what did the fund do? It allowed them to generate the puts. When you record it in regulatory accounting, you don't see the size of the true contingent, but only the instrument. Regulatory accounting only allows you to record the put, not the size of the problem they have. Obviously, that was more than 4 points of GDP, and that was a burden, and until it was resolved, we also had a problem stopping issuance. In fact, the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange, on the anniversary of the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange, had announced the Zero Excess Supply program. That is, we were only going to issue money against demand for money. understanding demand for money as the sale of dollars by the private sector. That is, you go buy pesos with your dollars. In that context, that was on a Friday. On Monday, we had a meeting with the banks. The president of the central bank and the minister of economy had a meeting with the banks at 10 a.m. And while the banks were sitting at that table, Banco Macro, a bank that grew in size by doing business with Kirchnerism, by being Kirchnerism's banker, executed the puts. In other words, it executed puts for the equivalent of $2 billion. I want to know how many times in Argentine history you've seen a run on $2 billion and the economy not collapse. Caputo, Basile, and Cournot achieved that. That's why I always mention them and highlight them so much, because they managed to twist the market into a run of $2,000. And do you know why we did it? We did it because on the other side, we had 17 trillion pesos, which we accumulated thanks to the fiscal surplus. But not only that, the guys there weren't content. And they came after us the following week in a race to try to make the dollar jump. And in that context, I remember that at that time I was about to speak at Sun Valley. I was there the day before. And with Minister Caputo and the president of the central bank, we decided to move forward with an even deeper stage of monetary control, which is zero issuance, directly zero issuance. Therefore, if they wanted to chase us away, let them do it. Let them attack our currency. But sooner or later the dollar was going to collapse and they were going to fall. And indeed, they're having a really bad time because they saw $1 in 2000, and the dollar is around $1,250. Hello, baboons. That said, one of the things under which, what would the zero intervention equilibrium look like? Because they came out and said we were intervening in the foreign exchange market. That is to say, economists are capable of saying anything they want to justify their errors. So, what would an intervention-free market be like? I would leave the money supply constant. The exchange rate would fluctuate and the change in reserves would be zero. So, what's happening to us? We still have the stock problem. Oh, let me ask you something. Does anyone have any idea how many regulations the previous government introduced into the foreign exchange market? I say that because they're talking about lifting the currency controls. And we're constantly saying, we're closer, we're closer, we're closer, and they say they didn't do anything. Do you know how many regulations Kirchnerism introduced in the last 2 years? Let's see, I'm hearing proposals for numbers. 500 would be an aberration, no, yes or no. Who was it? 500. It would be an aberration. Let's see, higher. 2,100, higher we go. Go on, 5,000. 5,000 would be nonsense. Number 12,000 would be, it would be crazy too, no. There are good people putting their heart into it. We're clear that if it were 20,000 it would be totally crazy, no. Fine. Exactly, I like us to speak in Latin, a tremendous mess. Well, hold on tight to your chairs, 80,000. So, the central bank is issuing regulations at an average rate of 100 per day. In other words, We're constantly making progress in eliminating the cepo tax controls. In fact, the best indicator of this is that when we took office, only 15% of imports were paid, and today it's 90%. So, you can see that we are making progress. In fact, I'll tell you in advance, in the next few days we'll be publishing a log of the things we're doing. I mean, that way. When they calculate how much we manage or not, they'll do the math better. So, now that we have the cepo tax controls, what's the problem? That the dollars we bought at the MULC are not money demands. That is, money demand is when I take dollars and buy pesos to make transactions, but since I have capital control and exporters are required to liquidate, that's not buying pesos. It's selling dollars. Therefore, we were issuing money, and there wasn't any demand for money, and that caused the inflation rate to drop more slowly than we would have liked. So what we said, let's return those dollars. Why? To get the pesos out. Obviously, since there was a gap, for every $3 we bought in the MULC, we could withdraw the pesos we had issued with $2. And we would have $1 left in the central bank. So, if you look closely, what's going to happen? How much will the amount of money change? 0. I have a slight increase in reserves. And the exchange rate will be more free. In other words, in our previous equilibrium, we had $3 of intervention for every $3. And today, for every $3 of intervention, we cleared 2. Therefore, there's 1 left. That is to say, the new equilibrium has less intervention, less variation in the quantity of money, and therefore the rate at which the inflation rate is falling is much faster. So the question is, this is also technical. This is the first time I'm going to express it in public. Obviously, this is an audience that is in a position to assimilate what I'm going to say, because you have inflation, which is observed inflation. But there is inflation induced by the macroeconomy. Therefore, the true inflation is the remaining inflation. If I have, in the case that I have a fixed exchange rate, suppose I had fixed the exchange rate against the dollar, therefore, I would be importing what? The inflation of the United States. That is, I would have inflation, which would be the inflation of the United States if money were determined endogenously. Because I fixed the exchange rate. That said, it means I have 2. And if I also devalue, I would have to add the devaluation. I have a 2% monthly crawling peg, plus my international inflation, meaning I have induced inflation of 2.4% monthly. The question is, why don't you release the restrictions? I say this because I haven't finished fixing the stock problem yet. But believe me, I have them. I'm aiming for them. At least by the end of the year, I'll see half of the regulations left by the cockroaches eliminated. That said, in that sense, it means that if I take 2.4% and take the true, observed inflation of 4, I have a 1.6% differential in consumer spending. What does this mean? If I annualize that number, inflation in Argentina is traveling at 20% annually. In other words, the true inflation generated by the macroeconomic environment means that the economy still has excess money. which is why it generates that level of inflation even when it doesn't issue. It's traveling at 20% in consumer spending. But what's going on? The consumer price has some components that taint the measurement, and it's always more interesting to look at wholesalers. Why? Because it's ahead of consumer prices. So when I look at wholesalers, I get 3.1. What does this mean? It's traveling at 0.7%, which is 8% annually. And if I take the rest of the wholesale price system, inflation would be traveling at 0.4%. If it's traveling at 0.4%, we're talking about inflation around 5 or 6% annually. In other words, if we're talking about hyperinflation, with levels of 17,000%, Argentina's true macro inflation today is traveling at 5%. And that was achieved without having gone through the hyperinflation that would have liquefied all the real balances. It was achieved without expropriations, in other words. We didn't implement a Bonex plan. It was done without price controls, it was done without fixing the exchange rate, and it was also done with tariff adjustments. If that's not worthy of saying that Caputo is the best minister of economy in all of Argentine history, I don't know where they're going to look for such strong empirical evidence in support of that statement. Therefore, I would tell you that in this new job I have, which they've hired me for 4 years, unless some coup plotter comes up with something different or the legislative establishment denies us funds for intelligence work. Because you've seen the saying that a thief thinks everyone is of the same condition. And a country that has suffered 2 attacks and is threatened by one of the countries that committed those attacks, in other words, I'm going to have to trust a little more in the forces of heaven so that nothing happens to me. But, by the way, if anything happens to me, it's their responsibility. Especially when they set up the bicameral parliament by putting a closet Kirchnerist and 2 other Kirchnerists, who are co-responsible for the pact with Iran. In other words, who planted the bomb in Argentina? I'm not going to give them the pleasure. I'm going to finish these 4 years, and I'm also going to be re-elected, and I'm going to get Argentina back on its feet. But since I see this as a job, I'm not thinking about staying in office forever. Luckily, I don't use the Rivadavia seat much. I don't develop any strange habits. But I must confess that I'm a paleo-libertarian, and a very lucky one at that. But aside from that, for those who don't know, paleo-libertarians are conservative libertarians. That is, we're monogamous and all that. I'll clarify why I include subtitles, because it's good for everyone. The neighborhood understands, but not everyone is forced to. That said, my job description said I had to lower inflation. And we're achieving it. My job description said we have to pulverize insecurity, and I believe the province of Santa Fe is a testament to Minister Bullrich's enormous work in eradicating insecurity. While I don't think it was explicit in my job description, I think it's also true that people are demanding that I grow the economy. I'm a specialist in economic growth for a reason. It's interesting that politics hasn't erased that yet, and neither has the liberal libertarianism. That said, the question then is, how are we going to grow? I mean, it's clear that sooner or later we'll defeat inflation. It's clear that we're going to defeat insecurity, but the question is whether we're going to grow. That said, it depends on how you define growth. If you look at it like Argentina, GDP growth is increasing. That's not necessarily growth, it's recovery, a rebound. There are elements that contribute to a rebound, that is, GDP increases linked to a rebound, and GDP increases to structural issues. The factors contributing to the rebound are a strong recovery in real wages. When you look at the wage indicators, wages have been systematically offsetting inflation for over 3 months now. Therefore, there is a wage restructuring. In other words, the ruthless liberal, who knows what, is making people earn more. Not only that, but pensions, with the change in the formula we proposed, also began to recover against inflation, and since inflation is declining, pensions are rising in real terms. This is increasing the purchasing power of demand, the purchasing power of Argentines. And given the level of installed capacity utilization, this means we can have an expansion in demand without having major effects on prices and with a strong impact on activity. Therefore, what we are seeing is the rebound in activity levels. Today, 8 out of 10 important high-frequency indicators show that the economy is moving forward. When you look at activity indicators, but they're old, it's clear you're seeing a floor between what it was around the second quarter of the year. And in that context, that gives rise to a rebound in activity, employment, and wages. In addition, there's an issue of the stock cycle. That is, in the face of the looming crisis during the latter part of the Kirchner administration, you accumulated stocks to avoid the crisis. To protect yourselves from the crisis, to be able to get out of the money. That caused the level of activity to be higher than it should have been, because there was a lot of investment in stocks. Yet, in the third and fourth quarters of last year, activity fell by 2.5%. I'm mentioning this because, while we were making the largest fiscal adjustment in history, it fell by 2.6%. I mean, it seems that doing things right, even while we're fixing the problems that generated 123 years of disarray, seems to be working much better than you thought. And in that context, stocks were liquidated, and the fall was exacerbated, and now they have to rebuild. Therefore, part of the rebound has to do with the rebuilding of stocks. In other words, that's what has to do with the current situation, with the rebound. So, where will growth come from? Look, growth comes from investment. To invest, you have to save. This is an interesting definition that the eco-no-chants don't seem to understand. We can also grow with the controls. Why? Because in reality, the fiscal adjustment we made returned 15 points of GDP to the private sector in the form of savings. Therefore, that greater savings means greater investment and, therefore, more growth. In other words, the fiscal adjustment we made, removing the oppressive leg from the neck of the private sector, which is public spending, while we were discussing hyperinflation in December. Today we are discussing 30-year mortgage loans. Ultimately, that's where the funds to finance economic growth come from. Not only that, but by eliminating inflation, we also eliminate the problem of relative price distortions. And that also generates a recomposition effect. At the same time, a zero deficit means working fully against country risk and high interest rates. Therefore, this also implies greater economic growth. As if that weren't enough, we implemented the largest structural reform in Argentine history. In that context, the largest structural reform ever implemented in Argentina was the one implemented at the beginning of Carlos Menem's administration, and it was the largest in Argentine history. With the ley bases, base law, the reform is 5 times larger than the one implemented by Menem, and if we add the DNU, Decree of the Unified State, with very clear benefits, for example, what happened in the rental market, the reform is 8 times larger than the one implemented during Menem's administration. And we did that in 6 months, with 15% of the Chamber of Deputies and 10% of the Senate. And why is this reform important? Because this reform allows us to climb 90 places in terms of economic freedom. And the freest countries are 12 times richer than the most repressed. It puts us on a path of strong growth institutionally, in line with countries like Germany, Italy, and France, that is, on a path of strong growth that could bring us back to those powers in dynamics in 40 years. However, for me, that's not enough. I can't reach that level. I want Argentina to be the freest country in the world. And in this sense, while we've already submitted 800 structural reforms and continue issuing regulations every day, we have 3,200 more structural reforms pending, and we're going to make Argentina the freest country in the world, so that it becomes the most prosperous country in the world. Thank you very much. Long live freedom, damn it.